Hey guys, and welcome back. Welcome to my backyard today because it's actually nice enough to be outside today, enjoying a little sunshine here. But today, guys, we are continuing on with our chapter 15 notes. So if you want to go ahead and get out your PowerPoint to follow along, go ahead and do so. And guys, today we are going to cover slides 11 through 15. All right, 11 through 15. So just a little recap of where we were. All right, we were kind of setting the stage for the different Civil War strategies that were going to kind of take shape during this conflict between the North and the South. The Southern strategy here is really to do a defensive war, to force essentially the North to kind of come into their territory, attack into the Southern territory, which is going to cost them time and money and resources. And that's really the hope of the Southerners at this point, is to try to prolong this situation as long as they can, because the more costly they can make this conflict for the North, the larger likelihood that they will actually succeed in winning the conflict. Because if you remember, guys, the resources in this conflict are very heavily favoring the North. They have a lot more soldiers, they have a lot more guns, they have a lot more money. And so ultimately, that still continues to be the case as we move forward. So the Southerners are doing a more defensive strategy. The North, on the other hand, they want to try to use their weight. They want to try to use their advantage to go after this Southern possibilities. They want to go after Southern factories and transportation routes and boating and other things that may be happening. And so very closely into this, the North is using what's called total warfare. And that is not only an attack on the military installations of the South, but they also want to use their military strength to go after Southern resources and to really hurt them economically and kind of break the will of the South to fight. So anyway, once we get that's kind of a recap where we were. Once we get our notes up, you should see actually kind of what I was just talking about on a map. Slide 15 basically says overview of the Civil War strategy. So yet again, you can kind of see the defensive lines where the red arrows are of the Southerners. They're not really trying to extend into the North, at least not in the beginning. They want to try to keep a defensive perimeter and try to keep the North from driving into the heart of their areas. The North, on the other hand, is really doing several different battlefronts here. You can see the blue lines pushing into the Southern territories, and that's kind of to occupy the Southern forces. But at the same time, if you notice all the way over on the left, the two long blue arrows, that is where the North is really trying to essentially blockade the Mississippi River and keep that big trade route from benefiting the South economically. And then those little dots that are out in the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico, those are blockade points where essentially the Northern Navy was going to block Southern ports to keep their economy from working. And remember, the North has a very large established Navy. The South has a few ships here and there, but they're really very far behind in terms of naval superiority to the North. But anyway, that is a recap of the Civil War strategy map that appears on slide 15. Slide 15. If we can go ahead and click, that should bring us to slide 16. So what we get is the mobilizing of the home fronts. Guys, this is a massive war that was taking place. And much more so than, say, the War of 1812 and the American Revolution, this war is going to be not only fought on the front lines, but also it's going to be fought in the factories and the production that takes place. Because the Civil War, by most historical records, if you will, becomes really one of the first mechanized wars, where we see massive amounts of war materials produced, from guns to supplies to uniforms. And because of this, that new industrial system in the United States is going to kick into overdrive to try to provide those materials for the war effort. So as we see on our slide here, by 1862, the North and the South begin conscription. So first off, conscription means, guys, essentially a fast way of saying draft. Conscription literally means forceful entry into the military service. And so both the North and the South begin conscription, or the draft, which shows you the sheer numbers that we're going to be dealing with in this war. and partially why the death tolls end up being astronomical. They end up with like 500,000 deaths as a result of the Civil War. And so that's partly because of the size of the armies that are going to be taking place, partially because of the conscription that both governments will use. As far as the northern mobilization takes place, you have two different fronts. Number one, you have finances of the war. So they're trying to pay for this very costly, very expensive war. And so you have payment through taxes, which is going to be a huge advantage for the North. There's a lot more wealth located there and a lot more tax revenue that's available. They're also going to do something called war bonds, which essentially is you buying a bond from the government under the promise that they will pay you back more later. So essentially, put it this way. You say I buy a war bond for $10 now. In 10 years, maybe that war bond's worth $20. So I make $10, but the government gets to use my $10 towards the war effort. So bonds become very popular. Also, paper money that is not backed by gold becomes popular during this time period as well, because honestly, they needed money, so they started printing more. And that was their solution. And this continues still to this day. Our money is not backed by anything other than the American people's confidence. Ultimately, the North is not going to take over the war industries. They're actually going to use capitalism to their advantage. And so they use it as motivation to tell the factory owners, hey, if you produce more, we'll pay you, you can make money. And so private industry supplies the Union's armies well. They're readily available with guns, uniforms, other things that they need. And because the factories are profiting and because the factory workers are making money, that production will swell. And ultimately, the North will have a pretty readily available amount of supplies throughout the war effort. If we go ahead and click, it should bring us on to the next slide. And we are now going to talk about Confederate mobilization. They take a different route. Instead of privatizing war production, the government essentially is in charge of supplying the Confederate Army. It's a positive, I guess, because the government can control what's being produced. The negative side is that there's not as much motivation for the Confederate factories to produce, because they're not necessarily turning a profit. They're more so being controlled by the government, and so that is going to be a little bit lacking when producing supplies. Also, you have to cut through a lot of government red tape to be able to produce those things. You need the money to front it, capital, that kind of stuff like that becomes a sticky issue. Ultimately, the problem they run into within the Confederacy is they just basically started printing money like crazy right from the get-go to try to fund this war. The problem is it causes inflation, which is a decrease in the amount of money. So even though, say factory workers in the South were getting paid, that money they were getting paid was not necessarily worth a whole lot. And so that is going to affect the motivation to work too. If I'm working, my money I can't really spend, or that money doesn't go very far, it doesn't motivate me to do a whole lot of that work. And that's the major problem they have. Other huge issue the Confederacy is going to run into is their supply lines. The North had spider webs of canals and railways and roads and all kinds of stuff. The South was very much lacking in these major reserves of railroads and other things. And so even if the South could produce the materials, getting the materials to the soldiers could also be a very difficult thing, especially for the Confederacy. So, which slide am I on here? All right, that should be... Okay, we got two more slides here, guys. Sorry about that. So, if we're going to look on the next slide here, it says political leadership in the North, Northern success and Southern failure, Hint, hint, guys. This is actually going to lead a little bit into your quiz on... actually, you guys are going to be tomorrow, where we are going to compare Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. So, Lincoln expands his own wartime powers. He declares martial law, which essentially allows him to do things quicker without help of Congress. He essentially declares an emergency, which allows him to do whatever he needs as quickly as possible, kind of like the situation we're in now with coronavirus, where Governor Murphy has declared martial law to be able to react to situations as quickly as possible. Lincoln is also not afraid to imprison people who speak out against the war effort, which is kind of a weird picture for us to picture with Lincoln. We always picture him as this great president, but he actually locked up over 10,000 people who were essentially questioning the war effort and whether we should go to war with our own nation. And so he locks 10,000 people up without trial. He also briefly shuts down freedom of press and closes down newspapers to keep them from speaking out against this war effort. Jefferson Davis, on the other hand, who is the Confederate president, is more concerned mainly with his military duties. He neglects the civilian morale and the economy, which is going to have a huge impact on the South. They will struggle economically throughout the war, and lacks influence within state governments because he's not a very established politician. He is a general. And the South really was hoping that his military planning would outweigh those failings that he has elsewhere. As we go on to our last slide for today, slide 15, it's going to say early campaigns and battles. So Northern achievements by 1862. What the North has going for them: number one, total naval superiority. South really doesn't have a navy, so the North is dominating the seas and shutting down trade. Confederate troops cleared from West Virginia and Kentucky and much of the border states, so they have secured those border kind of territories and pushed the Confederate influence out of those areas. Other huge bonus for the North is New Orleans is captured, which is a major port, which also slows the trade through the Mississippi corridor, which economically affects the South as well. As we see on the bottom of this slide, though, Confederate achievements by 1862, essentially they're having a lot of success when it comes to the Army and the military campaigns on the ground. They stall campaigns in Mississippi, at Vicksburg, and also at Shiloh. They defend repeatedly their capital of Richmond, because remember, that was a war aim of Lincoln, was to try to break the will of the South and take over Richmond. And so they will essentially block the North from going into Richmond after several attempts. Battle of Antietam, also known as Bull Run, is one of those events. If you want to look it up, it's crazy. I'll actually post a video about Bull Run here for you today. All right. Anyway, that's going to be it for today, guys. Hopefully you got to enjoy the sunshine the last couple days. Don't forget about your quiz tomorrow, which I'll be sending out more information about. And hope you have a great spring break after completion of the quiz. I'll see you guys afterwards. Take care, be well, and I'll see you later. Bye.